see as the role of volunteer centres to support love and volunteering in this new volunteering world?
Great question, and I have great time for volunteer resource centres. The future can be better and can be brighter, and we each have the power within us to make it so. There will be challenges to face along the way, to which there are many solutions. There is a source of resilience deep within us all. And that verse from that poem I really dedicate to volunteer resource centres.
Well, to be honest, I don't think it's an easy task at all. First of all, I think they will have to rebalance their volunteer teams, which are, I think, rather affected by the aftermath of the pandemic, even if it's not fully gone. A lot of the volunteer teams have been affected, have been disturbed, have been frustrated by their lack of engagement or the need to really stay on the sidelines and not get involved so much anymore. And probably some of them even felt a sense of futility during this time of being homebound and all their activities going down or being cancelled even.
This is the one, personally, I'm not as sure of as the other questions that I've been asked today. Primarily because volunteer centres have really had to be rethinking their role for quite a number of years now. I think the landscape has been changing, but will continue to change in this post-pandemic environment. And I think that for volunteer centres, what that will continue to mean is that they will have to continue to reinvent themselves, because what we are beginning to really understand and see now is that traditional model that so many volunteer centres were built on, in the 80s and the 90s and into the early 2000s has changed. It was primarily that model where people that were looking for volunteering opportunities would wander along to their local volunteer centre. They would then be matched with the needs of an organisation through an interview and that kind of stuff. And then, they would be matched and go off and do their volunteer work with the organisation.
Volunteer support centres, I believe, are a powerful social infrastructure in every region of the world, especially volunteer support centers that work on local level, because this is our strength. We talk to people, and this, I think, is our priority that we must never lose. To listen to people, to help voluntary groups and associations to resolve the problems of the immediate local community.
I previously mentioned that we had 27,000 people come forward that were interested in volunteering. Yes, they're interested in volunteering, but they're not interested in the bureaucracy. So the work for us is around working with those people in terms of trying to address some of those barriers that might be there for them, why they haven't joined organisations in the past, maybe some of the bureaucracy that's there already they don't feel comfortable with, and see if we can work with organisations. So capacity building in the organisations is certainly one of the things I think volunteer centres can do. I think it's really good to offer a space, and that's something we've been doing in Volunteer Ireland, for volunteer managers to connect in and talk about the issues, to share. Volunteer managers, I think, offer in a bubble in themselves, and there might be a big it might be a big team there of staff in the organisation. The CEO has his or her job to do, but it's the volunteer manager who has to lead volunteering, and I think we in volunteer centres can offer that support.
I think that volunteer centres will have a really significant role in the future. They have always been vital in connecting volunteers and volunteering involving organisations. They provide such a unique role in supporting their communities by connecting people who want to give their time to or within organisations, and connecting them with organisations that deliver on their mission and vision through a volunteer workforce.
I believe the role of the volunteer center is so important because the amount of support that comes from these centers for volunteers, for other volunteer managers, the people that they are providing services for, is second to none. Being able to be there, to be on hand, to answer questions and provide services, and even if it's not so where we know what those answers are, but being in a position to where answers, you can find them and be a resource, I think is going to be absolutely huge, because there's a lot of change going on. There's a lot of shaking up, and just knowing that people who rely on the centers have somewhere to go, have a safe place to go to get the answers to questions that they need help with.
I used to work for Volunteering England, and one of the roles that I had there was responsibility for the support and development of the Volunteer Centre network, of which we had some 300 across England. That network has been significantly weakened in the past decade as a consequence of the UK government's austerity agenda, which has seen huge cuts in funding from central government to local government, which has required local government to cut back on their spending in turn, and that has impacted on what has been seen as non-essential services like volunteer resource centres, volunteer centre activity. So when the pandemic came along, we actually had a local volunteering infrastructure that was significantly weaker, in my view, than it had been 10 years ago, just like we had an NHS that was weaker than it had been 10 years ago. And whilst the NHS and the Volunteer Centre Network and other local infrastructure organisations have done an absolutely superb job during the pandemic, they've been doing so effectively with one hand tied behind their back.
I think that society and government will turn more to community to find solutions. And our resource centres must be making the case that the future can be better, hopeful and brighter by way of the very important work that they do.
Also, I think that volunteer centers could find different ways of reinventing themselves and their traditional services, and I would see volunteer centers becoming these innovation hubs where citizens could come up with either their availability of time or skills, or their ideas of creating things around their community, positive things, or solving specific issues or specific needs. And the volunteer center should be able to capture somehow all these offers and all these opportunities, and find a way to support the citizens that want to get involved, by offering either concrete programs or suggestions for other organizations to receive these offers, or bringing at the same table these actors that can move things in the right direction.
I think that for volunteer centres, it's about how do we reinvent ourselves and how do we find different ways of servicing both volunteers and volunteer involving organisation and other key stakeholders as well.
Well, one last thing I suppose is being that connection piece for volunteering. And I think what we've seen here in Volunteer Ireland is the importance of the social element of volunteering, and people realizing that when volunteering has been taken away from people, you're literally taking away a leg or an arm. It was a really important part of their life. And the challenge has been there in terms of communicate that message can sometimes be, well, you're not allowed to volunteer, and that's because you're at this age. So, in 2019, we weren't interested in whether the fact of you were 59 or 60 or you were 69 or 70. But because it puts you into one of the at-risk categories, no, you can't volunteer anymore. So how we communicate those things going forward is also a challenge for volunteer managers. And I suppose it is now our opportunity to step up to the mark, to show, I suppose, how successful volunteering can be. And we all know of the amazing things that are going on the ground. And I've heard some of the stories from yourselves. I mean, following you on social media, some of the volunteer centres, and been delighted to work with you there before. So it's nothing new, but I think we really have the opportunity to engage with each other and, you know, make the big global into a very small little world in terms of volunteer management, and learn from each other and take the steps forward from there.
So I think there's a really important activity that we need to do to highlight and showcase how effective local infrastructure organisations, as we generically term them here in the UK, have been, and really make that evidence there that without them we would have suffered so much more during the pandemic. So that's about making the case to funders to say these are bodies that we need to do something for.
We've seen through our experience of COVID just how impactful actually a network of local and regional volunteer centres is. They're a really vital, important infrastructure part of our volunteering ecosystem. They are connected to their local government, their civil defence networks, and they have wider networks within their communities, so they really know what's going on within their communities. So they're a hub, they know their people, they know their communities, but they've also always had a focus on capacity or capability growing within the member organisations that they work with. So they help organisations that work through volunteers to do that better, be it through training their volunteer managers, providing them with basic tools or recruitment help, or general training or best practice guidelines. They do so much. They also they're a bit of a hub within their communities, and they're often co-located within a community hub of some sort.
They need to seek more support from government, but they need to be able to articulate their case for more resources, for more funding. But I think that they too will need to embrace leadership. I spoke about that before. They must demand a seat at the table where our communities come together to prepare for future pandemics and disasters and rebuilding in society.
And I think because volunteer centres sit in that middle ground between volunteers and between volunteer involving organisations, they're going to have a really, really important role to play in understanding what people want from their volunteering and what organisations are offering, and trying to balance those two things out, squaring that circle as I referred to it earlier on. And I think partly that is about supporting volunteer involving organisations to develop new opportunities, to adapt their ways of working with volunteers to fit the new reality that they face. And that's something that I've been arguing for at least 10 to 15 years. I think, unfortunately, as a consequence of the way that they're funded, volunteer centres inevitably lead towards brokerage, matching volunteers to opportunities and organisations, and the work of supporting organisations to change, to adapt, to think differently about their offer based on what people want from volunteering drops down the agenda somewhat. So I think that's an area we have to put more effort and emphasis into, and I'd really encourage funders of local infrastructure and volunteer centres to think carefully about how they can enable that to happen by tying their funding more to that than counting the number of bums on seats in local communities. And I think they're also going to have a really important role as volunteer centres to understand what people want from volunteering. And there's a challenge for volunteer centres in there as well. I mean, many volunteer centres I've come across here in the UK won't engage with organisations unless they provide all the kind of formal structures, etc. I've already talked about the fact that that may be more off-putting to potential volunteers in future. But they also maybe haven't embraced that more informal community-based volunteering in a way that possibly they could have been. So how do volunteer centres outreach into those more informal groups to provide support to them, but also to understand what those people want from volunteering?
volunteer center could also be this space where citizens and organizations meet to find solutions to the issues around them, and not just related to the pandemic, but to all the challenges that come out of this crisis, or that continue to exist because issues did not stop because of the pandemic. Some of them got really visible and maybe even increased, but others are constantly there and will continue to need volunteer support.
For me, I think the immediate thing that volunteer centres can and should be starting to think about is how do they get on to the onto the remote volunteering kind of train with everybody else. How is it that they make available some really neat, cool resources and provide tools to their member organisations to learn about and engage with online volunteering and remote volunteering and volunteering in different ways? How do they continue to make it easy for community members to find and be matched with volunteer involving organisations in a way that the volunteering organisation can receive a volunteer that maybe has already gone through a bunch of screening and done some other things as well?
So I think they will be vital in getting local voices and local needs, bringing them together, but also channeling them up. We worked through COVID with, and still do, with our volunteer centre network. We met regularly and we heard from them on the ground what was happening in their local communities and what the challenges were, and we were able to feed that up further.
I think in the future they will redefine themselves as community participation hubs and be a breeding ground for community solutions and activism at place, again in the communities. They may even change their names and expand their missions to truly galvanize community action. They have got to embrace change. They have got to be more strategic in their thinking. And I keep saying it, more proactive than reactive.
So I think volunteer resource centres, volunteer centres, whatever they're called, wherever you are in the world watching this, have a really fundamental role to play, a really important role to play. We used to talk, aside from the brokerage and the developing opportunities, about volunteer centres driving up good practice, about volunteer centres doing more awareness raising and marketing around volunteering, about doing more policy response and campaigning. And I think all of those kinds of activities are going to be really important. You know, volunteer centres working much more closely with local government and local health teams, at least here in the UK, to help them think about how we deal with, you know, future outbreaks of COVID-19, for example, and what support is available. And I think there's going to be this big debate happening about national and local initiatives. So again, I referenced the NHS Volunteer Responders Programme earlier on in my remarks today on this panel, and how that was a very formal top-down structure that was great at recruiting volunteers but not plugging people into that volunteer support. And the reason for that was because local communities were, or local organisations were, slower to mobilise and think about the opportunities that they had available and connect into that national programme. Well, if that was done through local volunteer infrastructure organisations, local volunteer centres, where there's already an extensive array of opportunities available and extensive awareness of what's going on, then we need to find ways of plugging those two things together so we don't have that mismatch.
I think it's going to be absolutely crucial to what volunteering is going to look like in the future, not just immediately after COVID, but generations to come. But it's going to start with what we're doing now. And so I really believe that having that there for people to learn about even the opportunity to volunteer, and then people getting the support from it, I think is going to be absolutely huge and absolutely crucial. And as far as seeing the next part of volunteering move into the generation of what is to come?
I think they need to diversify and become more diverse if they are to survive in a post-COVID world. And once again, they need to co-design with their communities and co-produce with their communities. I've talked a little bit about how volunteer managers and coordinators may need to change for the future, to adapt to the future. They need to have the backing of their volunteer resource centres in that. And the volunteer centres really need to go on that journey with them. So they need always collaborate to make a hopeful future. They do a great job, but they can do a greater job into the future. More and more people in our society will eventually know more about volunteer resource centres or whatever they may be named into the future.
Volunteer Centre, just like volunteering, is fundamentally about people. And one of the things that I mourn the loss of more than anything else over the last 10 years of local infrastructure being defunded here in the UK or here in England has been the loss of people from volunteer centres, because as those managers leave, as those staff leave, they not only leave the organisation, but they take with them often many years of community contacts and connections and trust within the local community. That has to be built from the ground up when the volunteer centre is reimagined or somebody decides that they now need that service in place. And so I hope that one of the things that we recognise coming out of this pandemic, wherever we are in the world, is that volunteer centres aren't just in that abstract, that concept of an organisation, but are fundamentally about people and trust and community and understanding of communities and bringing those communities together. And I think if we can focus on that, we'll build our local infrastructure that is fit for purpose wherever we are in the world in order to be able to deal with whatever challenges the future throws our way. Hopefully challenges that are not as significant as those that we've seen in the last year.
So it's a much shorter answer, this one. I think that for volunteer centres, it really just is that opportunity to jump onto the train with everybody else, to provide the tools, to find ways of communicating how volunteering is changing, and to remain relevant in that landscape as quickly as they can. Because what I believe is going to be the new normal will be that both volunteers and volunteering involving organisations, because of technology amongst other things, are going to have that little bit more autonomy and independence in the new environment. So the challenge, I think, for volunteer centres is how do they fill that gap in the middle without being left out in the cold. Tough message to think about, but I think a really important one, because I, for one, do believe that there is a place for volunteer centres, and that's a really important place. And so I would hate to see that they were lost, or that role became irrelevant. So some really neat challenges there. I wish everyone the best of luck.